Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Code with Italians. Today we have Ian with us. Hi, Ian. Welcome.
Hello, hello.
How's it going?
Not too bad. Not too bad. It's bright and sunny here, so I can't complain too much.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that we have kind of covered before, but not really knowing exactly what we're doing because it's us. So we are going to be talking about navigation, and the reason you're here is that you are the go-to person for navigation. And as a reminder for everyone in the chat, if you have any questions, please put them in the Slido. Ivan has put a link there. It's going to come around again soon. Just put all your questions there. Go there and check other people's questions. Upvote the ones you care about so we can prioritize answering them in the most useful way for everyone. So before we begin, Ivan?
Yes. Welcome everybody and thank you for the support. I just posted again the link for the questions. If you want to add yours and vote others' questions, you are more than welcome. Also, if you want to support us, there are plenty of ways. My favorite one is the one that I just did because I opened Twitch and he told me that I could subscribe to the channel, and because I have a Prime subscription, Amazon Prime subscription, I can subscribe for free. So Uncle Bezos is too busy sending rockets, but also giving you free subscription for one channel every month, and you can pick us. You can also check our coffee page where you can buy things like the metal pin, you can buy the stickers. This is one of my favorite, and our all-time bestseller sticker is the validate cache and restart. Go figure. And if you like the t-shirt, you can also buy it on our merch store. And that's it, Sebastiano. Let's try to do navigation properly. What do you think?
Let's see. Let's try.
Easier said than done, Ivan.
Fair enough. I mean, we need to try. We need to try. Lead by example.
So, Ian, I think maybe a good place to start would be to explain why we need navigation to begin with.
Oh, I mean, you don't need navigation at all. I mean, it's great. One page should be enough for everyone. I think it's actually pretty interesting to see how mobile apps have kind of evolved. Like if you think about the very first mobile apps, well, one screen was actually like a pretty decent app, and you're like, oh, I can get away with that, And then you get into like this whole era of like mega apps, like the Facebooks of the world, like in a lot of markets, like there's WeChat that is the everything kind of an app that has everything inside of it, right? And but most apps fit somewhere comfortably in between, where hopefully they don't have thousands of screens, but maybe it's a little bit more than one. But even some of the simpler apps you see, it's like, oh well, they have like help screens and a whole bunch of things that like you don't see on a daily basis, but are still part of this like multi-screen app. Yeah. And a lot of this is how you do multiple screens in Android has changed a lot over the years. I think in the wee old days where it was multiple activities and every screen was its own activity, and I think that was very tied into the Android platform itself, right? Like you either loved it'll take care of the animation for me, or you're like, oh, I can only do this little bit for animations, like that's a little limiting. And hopefully we've come a little bit farther from that. But the world of navigation has kind of changed a lot from a guidance and kind of what Google's offered even. Because even back in the day, just 4 years ago, 5 years ago now.
Back in my day.
Back when a lot of Android developers were kind of already got their stuff together, right? Even then there was, not a lot of guidance on navigation. It was kind of a write your own world. And for a lot of people that worked great. And for big companies, like almost every big company that we talked to already built their own navigation thing, just because they're like, no, we're not writing fragment transactions. Like we don't do that here, kind of a thing. Like we're going to build layers on top of that makes all that easier, right? And and that same applied if you were using views or fragments or anything else, right? Like Conductor was a good example of a view-based navigation library. And it was about 5 years ago that we're like, you know what? Like maybe we should actually help developers just a tiny bit more than go do it yourself. Like have a whole navigation team on your app that writes a navigation framework that lets you not write fragment transactions ever again. And that was very much kind of where the navigation component started, where that's all like, well, let's not just leave you to the wolves, but let's actually provide guidance, i.e. what you should actually be doing, and then a library that actually implements that guidance, right, and makes things a little bit easier. And we, even at that time, 5 years ago, we knew that we weren't going to be building this only for fragments. So we had actually built this in a way because we knew Compose was going to be a thing. Like maybe it wasn't called Compose at the time, but that whole idea of, no, there's something beyond views, there's something beyond fragments. So we had kind of built it from the ground up as kind of a generic nav controller. And then it turns out that we just provided the fragment one to start. And more recently, with Jetpack Compose actually becoming a thing, now I guess 3 years ago, we expanded that generic thing into the Compose world also. That kind of brings us almost up to where we are today. But the thing is, like, even now, like, there's so many other options for navigation components, right? Just like how every large company has their own way of building things. Like, Slack has Circuit, right? Decompose is another example, right? There's a lot of different choices for Compose, even more so than there ever had been in the Vue world, which I think is a good sign that this is actually a really hard problem.
It's also kind of like heartening to see that it's now something that people can actually focus on and ship something that works publicly, even as a solo dev sometimes, and still it's fine, which was way more complicated, I guess, back in the day when you had to do fragment transactions and stuff like that. I mean, I know I cannot badmouth fragments in your presence, Ian. I know.
Oh no, I badmouth fragments in my presence. I mean,
that's the fascinating part. I mean, it feels like navigation was born from like a weird combination of we love developers and we hate fragments, so we need to build something, something to fix this. So it was a good emotion, right? It was a good reason. I think it was a good reason.
I mean, if you stay on the straight and narrow happy path of fragments, everything works great. We even have a whole fragment strict mode, which is like trying to specifically block you from going off the happy path. But navigation on top of fragments was really kind of that, like, no. Those edges don't even exist anymore. Like, we'll take care of the edges for you, and then you can only stay on the happy path. And that does mean that we took on a lot of the grungy work. Like, our fragment navigator is something you don't want to have to reproduce in your own app. Let me say it that way. But
suspense.
Navigation.
Sorry, Ian, you froze for a second when you said "but." and then it was a perfect cliffhanger, but
Sorry, yeah.
that's all right.
The Fragment Navigator is quite gnarly, but the Compose Navigator quite a bit nicer. So, and that's just some of that, like the layers we're building on are a little bit more solid, and that helps out a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, even the navigator for Fragments, it would have been very tough to do without Fragments into Android X, right? Because you couldn't, if you were to have to deal with the Fragments implementation in the platform, that would have been.
Yeah, don't even talk about them. we like they haven't gotten updates for 8 years now. Like they're past their due date by a while. But and that's the interesting bit is like there's certainly this like migration kind of world, right? Where not every app is a pure Compose app, but those are the best apps to work on. So I'd say like we can focus our time on the Compose side now and just be like, let's just assume that the old world doesn't exist and go from there.
One thing when we talk about navigation, I think it's important to say that, well, because navigation is not in and by itself an easy problem. When you think about navigation, you tend to think about, oh, how do I go from one screen or one state to the next? But there's another very important and I would say foundational part to the to the navigation library, which is deep link support. And that I can imagine is an extra layer of fun, let's say, on top of everything else. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like so much of the stuff we do is to make deep linking incredibly easy, right? And it's like well, why do you have to do all this other work? And it's like, well, because then the incremental adding of, oh, I want to add a deep link to this destination, right? Suddenly becomes really easy because you've kind of structured your app in a way that's deep linking friendly, right? And some of that kind of ties way deep into kind of how navigation is structured in general, right? Like this whole idea of like, well, your graph structure, right? That map of your app of these screens are, tied together in one graph kind of is what drives the whole, well, we can do deep linking for you because you've told us ahead of time what things need to look like, right? And so some of that makes things way easier to work with, but it's also a very different approach than no, you have to write all this yourself kind of thing.
So in terms of navigation in particular, one of the nicest things about the API is the fact that you can do navigation, you can do deep linking as well using a Typesafe API, which is not something you could have done before unless you had your own custom solution. But then again, if you have a custom solution, you probably don't need to use the navigation library anyway. So why was it created, and also how was it designed, this API? What were the scenarios that you were trying to cover?
Yeah, I think some of this is trying to look at some of the other patterns that have been out there. But one of the things that really kind of was a big part, particularly for navigation compose, was the idea of like routes, which are really kind of the web URL for every screen of your app, right? It's kind of taking that idea of like, oh, what really is the difference between a desktop app and a web app and an Android app? And it's like, well, the technology is all a little different there, but the actual idea of like, oh, well, you have this screen, you have this screen, you have this screen are kind of all the same. So actually, Ktor was a big inspiration because they have their own kind of router kind of thing. It's something you use in web more so. But this idea of like, oh, well, you declare what your route is and what the arguments of each one of those routes is, and then it's the one that's doing the moving between the different web pages of your app, right? And I think the same kind of thing was really kind of a focus for navigation here too, where it's like, well, how do you say what is this unique screen of my app, right? And in the fragment kind of world, we were in this XML-based world where you had like these unique build IDs. And it turns out as soon as you move to a Kotlin DSL, this whole idea of like unique build IDs that are generated at build time kind of gets thrown out entirely. So we needed some other way of being like, well, what's the identity of a screen, right? And it turns out that web URL-esque kind of things, which we call routes, again, kind of really playing into the whole navigation kind of a world. Like you navigate on a route, we try our best. But that idea of like, all right, well, where are you going to, right? And then like, how do you define what that screen is? And that had a lot of downstream impacts to a lot of the stuff. Particularly, arguments and type safety.
Okay, I think one thing we can do now is we can I can share my screen and we can look at the documentation for this because it's very interesting. Let's see if I can actually paste it. And I'm gonna put the link in the chat for people if you wanna follow along, but we're gonna look at it together anyway. Also because there's someone we happen to know right here.
Yeah. So when we first started Navigation Compose, we kind of focused our docs on like, here's the simplest bit of code. And it turns out that the simplest bit of code might not be the best bit of code. Might not actually be the code that you emulate when you have 50 screens in your app or 100 screens in your app. Because then you get into this whole other fun time where you're like, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have 24,000 lines of code in one file. I don't know, just a suggestion. Fragments do it, but maybe that means you shouldn't do it, right? View.java, don't even look.
No, we don't want to go there. We don't want to go there. Well, I mean, I don't want to go there because I don't have enough RAM to open the file. That's the thing. It's more like constraint.
Dedicated GPU just for rendering that page.
Yes.
I will say that View.java actually broke DAC for a while because they did an update on how they were parsing pages, and it was too much for them to parse all at once. And I was like, wow, okay, we've officially won. But
wow.
we're
so that's why
over
you,
it now.
you jumped to quantum computing. Now I understand why you're building the whole quantum computing thing.
I mean, it makes sense. How else do you understand the view system, right?
For a quick note for people that don't know, DAC is developer.android.com. It's DAC. So when you hear people saying DAC, that's what it means.
Yeah. You can actually do d.android.com and it'll figure it out. It's great.
Yes. It's great because all the android.com subdomains, you can actually short them to their initial letter.
Yeah,
this is great. A lot of insider information, people. I'm gonna just mark this on the stream.
Just put a marker, it's important.
Yeah, that's
people need to know. I think the only thing that doesn't work anymore is b.android.com. They used to bring you to the bug tracker, but I don't think it does anymore.
Yeah. Probably not.
Okay, so
we decided we'll write docs. That's great. But actually, we're like, no, wait, you know what's nice? A video. So at our Android Dev Summit this last year, we kind of decided, no, we're going to tackle this more. We'll write the docs, we'll write a video, we'll explain how some of our internal apps that are using Navigation Compose are actually able to scale up to the 50, 100 plus screens, and what kind of they found successful here, and share it with all you.
Nice. This, you know, the whole screen amount in one app has been for quite often in my career one of those moments, because when you join as a consultant, the usual thing is, can somebody walk me through the app just to give me an idea? And then what I typically do, I start taking screenshots of the screens, right? So, you know, you just want to build this navigation map. And it always happens that, you know, you're like 10 minutes in and things start like getting very weird, you know, because wait, what? But this screen, how did we end on this screen, right? So no, because we come from here, and the designer goes like, oh, that shouldn't happen. And I was like, it happens, okay? So this is, so I just clicked, okay? So, you know, navigation is one of those topics that it's nice at the beginnings, everything is, you know, ponies, rainbows, and then you put deep links, and I was like, okay, but we shouldn't be able to jump into this screen because, well, there is no dependency injection. So we jump on a screen, there is no user manager, and we were supposed to have the user manager. You know, it gets very, very complex very quickly, especially if you approach it in an incremental way. So it's a tough job.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think people liked some of the XML, you know, the visual kind of designer from the navigation with Fragments, where it's like, wait, why is there a line between these two screens? Like, who added that? Like, why are those things connected, right? And you know, we don't quite have that same level of visual stuff in the Compose world, although we are trying to think about what preview would look like for a navigation graph. But if anything, it's even easier in an IDE because you can just find usages, right? And you know, try and see, all right, well, who's calling this anywhere, right? But this kind of gets back to the like, well, how do I actually, well, what am I fine usaging on, right? How do I know all the places that call this one screen, right? And that's kind of what we had talked about in this page, where really we want that idea of having the screen itself be independent from navigation. Like if your screens are tied into a particular navigation library, then swapping something out or swapping where it's called, things like that, all of a sudden become way, way more complicated, right? And things like preview and tests become way, way harder, right? So actually the very first step on this page was make your screen, but don't add anything navigation to it, right? In classic Compose sense, right? The first step is actually, you know, have state in, events out, right? That's like Compose 101, right?
Yes.
And treating navigation in the same way, it's just an event out, right? And you know, that might be, I clicked a button saying go to this person's profile page, right? But the screen itself, and when you're previewing it and when you're testing it, shouldn't have to care about nav controllers and routes or any of that junk, right? All it should say
how
is,
you end up here, you know, it's just
go to this person, right? And that person might be a user ID, right, or whatever, right? So it's something enough that says, here's the person that was clicked on, right? And that's kind of the basis for everything. Like, don't add navigation things to individual screens, right? Because it's going to make testing harder. It's going to make, you know, mocking things out. It's going to make all I want is like, did this Lambda get fired, right? That's the important thing, right?
So
check the behavior, test the behavior, don't test the implementation. It's like, it's gonna navigate. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's when you put everything together, it's gonna navigate. In testing, it's just gonna it cold.
So what
That's
you're saying is that the navigation library has tests, so you shouldn't need to retest that, right?
Right. Yeah, what you want to focus on is your screen, right? The data is displayed correctly. If I click on something, it does something, right? Like, all that stuff should work kind of in isolation, right? And that's really kind of that step one. And I feel like that's already where people get a little bit messed up, where they're like, oh, I'll just pass my nav controller into the screen. I'll call navigate inside my on-click listener. And we're like, whoa, just half a step back. maybe a big step back, right?
Hoist everything.
Yeah, hoist everything. There is a dependency. Do you really need it? Just hoist. Just give me an event. How about I give you something that you can call?
Right.
I think we missed a trick here. We could have had like a clippy thing in Studio for April 1st that is like, oh, you're trying to pass down a navigator, I see. Are you sure you want to do that?
Right? So that whole idea of like, all right, well, let's separate out navigation from the screen itself. That's like step one. All right, that I think makes sense. And then we get into kind of that, what's step two, right? And that's where we kind of have that wrapper around, all right, well, how do I represent this screen in terms of the navigation component, right? And that's really defining, all right, well, what are the inputs of the screen, right? What are the arguments that screen requires, right? And then what format should those be in? Is it an int? Is it a long? Is it a parsable? Like, it could be anything, right? And that's that integration layer where we say, hey, are you using hilt view models, right? Like, maybe that shouldn't be something in your screen itself. Maybe that's something that you should be providing a state object to your screen, right? Like, keep all that framework out of your screen, right? You use that integration layer as kind of that case where it's like, oh, I need to get a nav backstack entry to get some view model, right? Like, okay, well, don't do that in your screen. Again, kind of do that in that wrapper around the screen, right?
This is something that you kind of see people do in Compose, where they put business logic in the composables. And that obviously can cause a number of problems, because if that stuff is done on every recomposition, it might be complicated, like it might be heavy in terms of computation, or it might have side effects, which you probably don't want. So I think that's also like a general advice. Keep your composables to the UI only. Don't do anything with logic in there. If you have anything more than a if is visible, then you probably are overdoing it.
Well, and that kind of has that same thing where it's like, well, all right, I have some on-click, right? And like some of those on-clicks might be navigation events, right? But some of them might be mark this person as my favorite person ever, right? Your favorite button, right? And it's like, well, okay, that's not a navigation event, right? But at the same point, like, again, that's kind of one of those, well, should your screen actually just be firing a Lambda that then your view model picks up that, please favorite this person, right? So the whole idea of like, okay, well, there's some things inside that wrapper layer that it's not necessarily doing only navigate kind of Lambdas. It's also like, should you really be passing your whole view model down? Maybe not. Like, maybe you should be passing the state that you've called like collect as state with lifecycle. And instead of passing in a view model that you call methods on, maybe it's you have a click listener, right? That is you're just passing that on to the view model to talk to a repository, to mark someone as favorited in room, and that whole shebang. But your screen couldn't care less about if you're using room or SQLite, right?
Shouldn't care less. Let's put it that way.
I mean, some people probably are doing room databases directly in their composable.
But, I mean, jokes aside, I saw a lot of examples and projects where if you build the screen in a, let's say, naive way, the screen ends up doing so many things. Then when you starting hoisting, right, you end up with like a gigantic constructor, because you have like, instead of pass, okay, so I can't pass the view model because they say that passing the view model is bad. So let's say I'm making a lambda for everything that actually I'm calling on the view model, and you end up with 15 objects in the constructor. And
that you're passing 7 layers down, by the way.
Yeah, because you're passing, you're right. At some point, there is a lambda that is passed 15 times in like a whole navigation tree. And because at some point, somebody has to call, I don't know, location manager, whatever, right? But it happens that you get, you don't have time, you're frustrated, and say, you know what? Fuck it, I'm giving you the view model, and then we are gonna refactor this later, and as in never, because what I mean. But I can understand. So lately I came to acceptance with, okay, there are suboptimal solutions because there are constraints, but it's okay and it's right if you know what's the proper way is, right? Because at that point, even doing it the right thing becomes a constraint and forces you to rethink the screen. Maybe we can split the composable, or we can do a quick iteration, especially if you do like pair programming. Because I mean, there is always the fact that I do it often with Aurelio. He's in the chat. That if you are too close to the tree, you don't see the forest. The same. And then you just need somebody else and say, okay, what do you think? And most of the time it's like, this thing is shit, because it's that kind of relationship. And then it's like, okay, can we improve it a bit? So I understand the frustration and the need of simplification, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and I think everyone, it's like, how pure do you really want things to be, right? I think passing in a view model at kind of that topmost level, sure. I mean, it's not going to hurt anyone. Like, no one's going to physically be in pain looking at that code. Like, at least it's not fragments.
Sebastiano is going to be in pain.
No.
He's that
at the top level, like if this is a screen composable, I'm okay getting the view model there. I just won't pass it any further down.
Right. And some of that's, it's like, well, thinking about it in terms of like, well, how close are you to Kotlin multi-platform, right? And, like how much are you wanting to kind of separate yourself even farther away from libraries, right? Where, it's like, well, do I really want my screen to be pure compose, right? Like no external libraries at all, right? And there it's like, we have a whole page on like state holders, like this idea of like, oh, well, not everything needs to be some view model that survives config changes, right? It could just be like, here's a place where I store my 7 lambdas, right? Like, okay, right, great. I have 20 lambdas on the screen, and you're like, okay, well, like, one, our user is going to know there's 20 exit points to this screen? I don't know about that. Like, maybe at that point, your screen's already a little bit too complicated, but, hey, business wanted 7 promo screens on this one. Like,
yeah, I mean,
iOS
is doing.
Or maybe
iOS is doing.
Maybe you're implementing like the Google Docs editing screen where you actually have to have 20 of them, and it kind of makes sense.
Well, and
I mean, there's very, very limited scenarios where I can say, okay, let's try and find a way to make it look a bit nicer than that. But I understand the need for all those features being there.
Right. Yeah. But again, the whole idea of like, well, like what really is your view model? It's a state holder, right? It's a thing that provides state. And if you want to update the state, you call methods on it, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, whatever you use to, encapsulate that, whether it's 18 lambdas or is it a state holder that has 18 methods on it that end up calling things, right? Like, whatever, it's fine. But the whole idea is like trying to, separate these concerns, right? And the things that should be handled by a view model, right? For an individual screen, if I want to favorite someone, right, can be handled at that level, right? But there are certain things like navigating to a new screen that aren't really something that's handled at the individual screen level, right? That's handled at kind of the navigation graph level, right? That's like one level up from the individual screen. And I think that's kind of where this whole idea of like, oh, well, my individual screen, my friends list screen, should it have to know what the profile screen is? Like, what if that profile screen is built by a whole different team, right? Like, okay, well, it's not necessarily that I should hard code in a navigate call directly on that profile screen, right? It needs to be kind of up that one more level of where is that profile screen and where is that, friends list screen actually coming together, right? And that's the layer that knows, okay, the profile screens that are the friends list screens that I want to navigate to the profile screen for this user ID, and I know about the profile screen. And I know how to call navigate to the profile screen, right? And that idea of like bubbling up events, where it's like, well, is that your app module? Maybe. I mean, in a simple app, right? Like you have one module for your friends list and one module for your profile screen, right? And it's maybe only the app module that's kind of the common piece between those, right?
Knows everything.
But that idea of like trying to break the compile time dependency between those two modules, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, if you have those two things in the same module, like, oh, type safety, easy. Like, the friends list screen can just call the profile screen directly, right? The profile screen can bring up the friends list for a particular person, right? Like, oh, they cross-link, no one cares, right? But what happens if they're in separate modules, right? And that's kind of the type safety and the multi-module thing. All of a sudden, like, throws out a lot of the things that are really easy if it's all in one module. Right? And so I think if you're looking at that,
we're saying that it's Gradle's fault.
No, come on.
Okay. Well,
I mean, I like incremental compilation. Like, I don't need to recompile the friends list when I'm actually working on the profile screen. Like, that makes sense to me, right? But I think if you look at like bigger projects, right, where it's not just you hacking on your own project, right? I have a team of 50, 100 people, right? You're like, I want an owner's file just for my directory. Like, please don't change my directory. Thanks. Like, you can touch your directory, right? And modules end up being another good kind of separation point, I guess. That gives you both that incremental part, which is super helpful for actually doing work, and also kind of that, like clear separation of ownership, right? So even the simple case of I have two screens, my friends list and my profile screen, like what happens if they're in separate modules, right? How do you do type safety?
Multi-module hello world, right? So I need somebody. So somebody on, you only know what you really need, And then, and then somebody knows everybody and try to coordinate a bit like, like dependency management, right? So you need a database. Somebody's going to give you a database, right? So you don't need to know how to get the database or, where is the database or what kind of database. At some point, somebody's going to give you a database, right? And then you are happy. And that's the idea. I mean, that will be the whole idea, right? Somebody clicked here. And we are expecting to navigate to the profile, and just take me to the profile.
Right, and and I think we've looked at a whole bunch of different approaches, about how you model that, right? And it's like, well, if you have module A, module B, right, and then you're like, okay, well, if it's a one-directional thing, you're like, oh, I'll just add a dependency. This is easy, and you're like, wait, like all of a sudden that's not scaling, right? But what about the other way around, where you're like, if they're cross-linked to each other, you can't just add a dependency between them. So I think I've seen this more common in like the fragment kind of world, where you're like, oh, I'll add a base module, and that base module just knows about everyone. And anytime I want to add a screen in my friends list module, I have to also add it to the base module. And then all of my feature modules depend on base, and base becomes an unmaintainable mess.
Yeah.
Because invariably, like,
it's very common, but it's very, I can confirm that it's very common.
I mean, super common, right? And I think it works really well right from the very beginning. But as soon as you're like, oh, I have 50 modules now, and all of a sudden I have like base, or like there's a basement, or like I've added libraries before base, so I'm like, oh, like how do I actually structure this? So the approach that we're recommending is actually the inverse, right? Where if you have a feature module, your friends list, right, and it is responsible for saying what are the public APIs that I give to other modules, right? So that might be navigate to the friend list for a particular person. Great. That might be here's the graph that is all of the subscreens within me, right? Like, and maybe it's a more complicated thing than just one screen, right? But it's the one that says, all right, well, here's the type-safe method to say, here's how I navigate to the friends list, right? And then your other module, your profile module, right? It's the one that's saying, all right, if you want to navigate to a profile, just call this method, navigate to profile, right? And it's responsible for kind of handling its own internals, right? And it's giving you only that type-safe wrapper around its module, right? And then it's actually when you bring those together into the same navigation graph, right, into your app module, or if you're more complicated, it might be 10 layers of modules down, right? But then you have that case where it's like, oh, I'm adding the friends list module, and it has a Lambda that's saying I want to navigate to profile. And all of a sudden, it's that app module, the lower, I guess, depending on which way you look at it, at the top of your dependency tree, right? And it's like, oh, I also have a dependency on the profile module. And it can say, oh, well, your module, you just need to call navigate to profile and pass that same user ID in. And similarly, and when you're defining and you're adding that friends list graph to your overall app graph, right? It's like, oh, it needs to navigate to a profile. Well, I have the navigate to profile, I have the navigate to friends list, right? And all of a sudden, you can build that kind of type-safe cross-linking without necessarily having this like base module that's getting out of control, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a GitHub repo with an example, something like this, like a tiny multi-module hello world with a bit of weird
I
dependencies?
mean,
No,
tiny and
because
multi-module are not like, how do you put
no,
them
but
together?
you get what I mean. I mean, I want like a hello world that is like 3 modules and a couple of them are dependent on each other and cross-referencing, and then you have a solution that it's okay to replicate and it will scale. That was my question. I guess now in Android, I don't know.
If only we had like a nice sample app for Compose that we could just point people to, that we have. Oh wait, we do. It's now in Android.
Boom,
if you
ready.
haven't looked at now in Android's code, I think it's a really good place to start for a lot of these things. It's actually one of the cases that, when we did this, like, hey, let's not just do a talk. Let's do a talk. Let's write the documentation, because not everyone has time to watch a video, except for all of us here on Twitch. And let's also update our samples to match the guidance, right? And that's kind of that idea of like, well, let's do a little bit more than just throw it over the wall. But let's look at now in Android, right? So even there, like, it only has a couple screens, right? But it's still kind of split up by individual features, right? So if you go into the feature folder of now in Android, it has a feature for bookmarks and for you and interests and settings, right? And each one of those things are providing just that little piece of the navigation graph that it owns, right? The For You page only cares about just the For You page, right? But where it links together, that's at kind of that navigation graph level, right? Where all of a sudden that's when, okay, now I see where these things interact with one another. And that also means you get that same testing kind of thing at the module level too, right? We talked about testing at the screen level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, oh, I have this one screen, I want to preview it. Well, if you're writing your whole module in terms of here are the lambdas that go to other modules, right? You can write an integration test app just for that module, right?
Nice.
And all of a sudden, like, your navigation graph, your app navigation graph could be just the For You ones, right? And you've actually like mocked out all the other external ones to be like, I would go to the profile screen if I had one, but I don't, because I want my compilation times to be this big, and I don't want to have to run the whole app to see my whole flow working, all by itself.
But instead of having navigate to in a Lambda, I have a log D in a Lambda, and I know, right? I know that the thing works, right? Okay, this thing is printing. Okay, that's legit. Okay, when we put everything together, it's gonna navigate. I don't want to care about this. So thank you for thank you for the repository. I was wondering, Sebastiano, do you think I'm one of those person that doesn't trust GitHub repos? So how many stars this thing has, right? Is it legit? I mean, is it 2007? Is it enough, Sebastiano?
I don't know.
Think?
Let me check.
Let go. Is it enough?
I think it's like
0.7 stars. I mean, that's not even 1 star.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't even get 11 stars. Come on.
That's the thing, right?
They got 1.5 quirks.
I think it is hard, like, especially, I've talked to a couple external developers who are like, wait, like, how does this actually work in a real app, right? And I think that's certainly been something that we've kind of struggled with, where it's like, okay, well, like, even now in Android, it's probably more ambitious than our previous sample apps, right? If you look at like the architecture component samples, right? Like we had our GitHub browser sample, which is like 2 screens.
Sure.
And for the longest time, like, that was the canonical place for like, how do I use this, right? So I think there's certainly something that, it's one of those, how do I kind of spread this out over what does it look like with 20 screens, with 30 screens, right? And that I think suddenly becomes a little bit different of a problem, right? But one of the things we did when we were trying to write these docs about type-safe navigation is this idea of you don't want to have to rewrite everything from scratch because you're moving to multi-modules, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think if we look at these approaches where it's like you have a base class or you have all of your navigate operations in one class, like that works fantastically if you're building a sample app that's never going to change and you don't actually have, you know, business customers who are like, I need 7 more screens added.
We have the
Yesterday.
summer promo we need 2 screens for. Why 2? I don't know, but I need both of them.
Right. I mean, you gotta have a whole promo thing that needs to be built by next week for Easter. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Got it. And I think when we start thinking about, all right, well, what does that look like when you have many modules, right? What I really don't want people to do is get started down a path and then realize, wait, I need a whole other approach to make this scalable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's the worst. That's the worst. When it works for today, tomorrow is okay, next week is still okay, then you go to holidays, and 1 month later is like, okay, but okay, and then like, and now the pain, and now the
Wait
pain.
until your manager finds out that foldables exist.
Well, I mean, you know what I think, that I'm a very so I'm a consultant, so, right? So I have like an escalation there. So I mean, if I stay, I'm billing you, and if I'm not staying and I just escape the pain, but again, but jokes aside, it happened even with pet projects. Pet projects. I have a couple of pet projects that are old, and I went through like infinite amount of rewrite because I try libraries, I try approaches and things like that. But then you start thinking about, okay, but the thing that I used in my pet project that it worked there, it's not gonna work here, right? Because maybe you have like a onboarding flow that is like 7 screens, and you're like, yeah, that thing won't work, right? So if I have probably home, settings, and about, everything is fine. And then you're like, okay, a login flow, deep links. So the struggle is real. So you need to start on the right path. And so if you have that kind of guidance,
I will say, we don't make it as easy. We still have some work to do where, our getting started page should probably get you started in the same direction of type safety, right? Like we have more work we need to do there, right? The other thing that we realize is like, well, okay, like that whole I need to structure my graph and the lambdas, like, great, that's your code. But there's certainly more we could do kind of on our end too. So in like the navigation in Fragments land, we have XML files, which were terrible and amazing in so many ways because they were fixed at build time and they were in a very specific format, which meant that we could write a plugin called SafeArgs, which would generate code based on your XML. Right? It's like at least a doable project right from the start. We're like, oh, great, this is fine. And then we decided to write a Gradle plugin and don't.
I mean, unless you really like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun if you only need to support one version of AGP.
Yes, I think that's where the pain comes from, because contrary to Android, it's not as easy.
Yeah, they're also working hard on kind of building up kind of that really nice future-proof API surface, and then it'll be great. But it served a need, right? It changed the source of truth, which was your navigation graph in XML, into type-safe code that your fragments could call, right? And that I still really like that idea, right? So I am not against generating code at all, right? I think that's great. And I think one of the things that's been interesting is kind of seeing all the different kind of community approaches to how do we generate code if we don't have XML files, right? So, I think like composed destinations is a really great example of like, let's go heavy on the annotation side, right? We have KSV, right? Like we know how to parse annotations and things like that, right? There's another library that uses Kotlin X serialization to kind of generate kind of this type-safe code behind it, right? And I think those are all really good approaches when you're thinking about, I want a single source of truth, right? And I think the approach that we're looking at right now is like trying to really use the code you've written as your source of truth, right? Just like how you have your XML, that was your source of truth in the navigation with fragments world. Your Kotlin DSL is really the source of truth in the Kotlin DSL world, in the navigation compose world, right? So trying to look at like, well, what's a Kotlin compiler plugin look like, right? Like, are there other ways of kind of doing this generating code where you really still have only a single source of truth? Obviously, like nothing yet right now. So, I think our docs kind of point out the like, here's the one-liner that you should write, right? That idea of not exposing routes at all in your code, right? It's like only in that one file, right? And trying to keep that kind of navigation-specific terminology in a navigation-specific directory, right? Or navigation-specific file, and not leaking all over all of your code, right? So I think even if we do generate code, I think it's going to look very similar to what our docs recommend you write yourself right now. So just keep that in mind from a future-proofing perspective. Is like, if you're following these docs, like the idea is that would be something that is only going to become an easier and more supported thing over time, and not something that you're like, oh, I need to throw away all of this stuff because they've decided on a completely different approach.
So I noticed we have about half an hour left, and we have like a lot of questions in the slides. Should we start looking at them? Because otherwise, I'm afraid, I mean, some of this we have kind of touched on a bit, but people do look at the slide, do upvote the questions you care the most about, because there's a lot of them. And again, we have half an hour. It's not that much time. So let's start with the most upvoted, which is from Stylianos. How's the status of allowing custom navigation animations without necessarily bringing in accompanist? Is this blocked while look-ahead layout is work in progress, or is it something else?
Yeah, so for what it's worth, accompanist navigation was where we kind of have been working on animation support. And when we started accompanist navigation, it was, I think, 18, 19 months ago. And we're like, great, we're based on animated content, which is the go forward thing for like screen to screen transitions and compose. It's experimental right now. Any day now, it'll be stable. It took 21 months for animated content to become stable. Two weeks ago, it was stable. I'm so excited. And that kind of finally opens up the door for moving a lot of the stuff that is experimental, that is no longer experimental, into the navigation component itself. So I'm actually really excited to see what that looks like. We're kind of right in the middle of a release right now for navigation, so it'll probably be the 2.7 release and not the 2.6 release that we're working on right now. But the idea is that, yeah, over time we'll have not things in accompanist, and we'll have more things in navigation itself as they become stable. What that looks like animated content plus shared elements is still TBD. It may certainly be that we have animated content and nice transitions, and the shared elements, you kind of get those for free. I know one of the things we're looking at is more of a modifier kind of a base thing for shared elements, which would work without actually adding new APIs in navigation. So more of that to come kind of later this year. It's certainly something that we're working really closely with the Compose animation teams and Doris about, kind of on a week-by-week basis.
When the time comes, you're more than welcome to come back with Doris, and then we can talk about this on both sides. Because I'm curious both in terms of the navigation implementation, but also how it works under the hood for shared element transitions. Because that's going to be super cool. Like two different viewpoints on the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's been fun talking to Doris about this, because she's like, yeah, all I need to do is add this one thing, and it's like, oh, okay. It turns out shared elements are still very hard, even in Compose world. So it's like, now look at layout as kind of one of those foundational pieces. That's kind of the beginning building blocks, but trying to get that up to the animated content level, which is really where navigation component and where other navigation libraries could try and hook into that screen to screen transition, is going to be really exciting to see how that looks like.
Fingers crossed it comes soon enough.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question. AndroidX.navigation has proven to be a great building block for libs like Compose destinations. Are there any other on-top libraries planned? I don't know if this is even something you can answer, but
yeah, I think I talked a little bit about what would safe args even look like in kind of a Compose kind of a world. I don't think it's necessarily a completely separate kind of a library, but kind of similarly to what we did in the rest of the navigation world. But again, still early days for a lot of that stuff. I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like.
And then another question from Stylianos again. If you want to share, what are your opinions about other built from scratch libs like Decompose, Voyager, etc.? What does one most likely miss out when going custom?
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the very beginning, like I am so excited to see this space really kind of have a whole bunch of different options, right? Because I think I was thinking back to a conversation I had with Leland at the very beginning, where he's like, hey, in React, there's 100 different libraries for how to do navigation in React apps. And then the community kind of ended up settling on a couple of them, right? And I think Compose is very much in that same kind of space where, the whole thing is navigation Compose is not actually part of Compose. It's not in AndroidX.compose.navigation. We never actually took that namespace, right? Because it is a separate library provided by a team that just happens to be at Google that you can choose from, right? But I think when we look at other libraries, like if Kotlin multi-platform is really important, Decompose has certainly been one of the first kind of navigation libraries that really kind of embraced multi-platform, right? Voyager and stuff all have kind of their own way of doing things, which I think can make a lot of sense if the structure of your app kind of is built to match that, right? Because that impedance mismatch is never really a good thing, right? So I don't ever want to say, hey, navigation Compose is the one true thing, please don't use anyone else. It's always been kind of a, hey, this is just another building block that you can build off of. So if it's not the building block you need, great. I will say that there are some things that I think we end up prioritizing. So the predictive back work in Android T and Android U, where when you swipe back, you get that nice like preview of the previous screen. In Android T, that was only going back to the launcher, but Android U's APIs are screen-to-screen transitions, where you actually get to peek at the previous screen as you swipe back before you actually release. And that's something that, like we as Navigation Compose are prioritizing quite a bit, because we want it to look fucking amazing on, Android U, right? You'd have to ask those other libraries on, do they even do the work for Android T for predictive back? Are they planning on doing the work for Android U for in-app back? Right, and those are questions that obviously we need to go to the maintainers of those libraries on. Are they going to support those kind of features? Because it ends up being a little bit bigger of a thing when you think about, all right, well, how do I run the animations? How do you do that sort of thing? So, that's something that I think we're vested interest in making sure that new Android things work well. But some of that support might lag behind, or might not be prioritized by another maintainer.
And in terms of things like deep links, state management, stuff like that, do you know what are the main differences there? If you do know, obviously.
Yeah, I think they've all kind of coalesced on kind of a couple options and things like that. But one of the things that we're really focused in on this year is I call it the magic triangle of architecture, which is navigation, whatever you use for your navigation solution, DI, whatever you use for dependency injection, and state management, whatever you use to store or maintain your state, right? And all three of those need to work perfectly together, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why you've seen, oh, well, like if you're heavy in the architecture components world, right? Like, oh, Navigation Compose and Hilt and view models, like it all works magically, right? Or if you're in like Slack's circuit world, right? Or ribs, right? They all have that triangle, right? And it's kind of one of those, like, as long as the library that you provide has an idea of each one of those things, right, then I think you're good to go, right? But if you're missing out that, like, wait, it's navigation, but it's not state management, or like, what's the DI story for this navigation library, right? That's when I think, that's what you need to kind of look at when you're evaluating these libraries, right? Because if you're using Coin or Hilt, right, that's going to severely limit what those other options are being, because it might be that that's not part of the triangle for that library.
Right, so it's more of a, like the bigger picture more than the choice about the library itself is rather what do you prefer to use in each of those three scenarios?
Right. Yeah, and in a lot of libraries, they end up doing all three at once, right? Like I think Circuit and Decompose are more on that like all-in-one kind of a solutions, right? And I think like the navigation component, like, well, we give you some tools, right? But do we care if you're using Hilt or Coin? No. It's kind of up to you on what DI solution you want to use, right? And I think there's a tradability of flexibility versus like built-in kind of a thing that is really one of those, like, how much do you really want to destroy your whole world kind of a thing, right?
Would you say that the navigation library tends to not be too opinionated about the other things, or would you say that it still has a strong preference for using Hilt or whatever?
Yeah, I think some of that is more on the state management side. It tends to be more opinionated. Like obviously things like view models and stuff are kind of a built-in feature, especially when you consider that like sharing across multiple screens kind of a thing. There's not really other options that we provide out of the box, right? Besides what you get for free with Compose, with Remember Savable and state holders and things like that. Which are very much within that one screen. So in some ways, very opinionated on that front. On on other ways, it's like, well, whatever you do with that, like, doesn't matter as much. So it's always a little bit of a give and take on each one, but certainly trying to make it more of a here are things that you can build on, but definitely on the more opinionated side of libraries than most of the Google offerings.
So the top question we have now, there isn't too much of a context, but what is the recommended way? One scaffold or multiple? What makes more sense usually?
Yeah, I think this answer will change a bit when we have shared elements. I think if you look at building a Compose app right now and you're like, well, what is common elements versus what are shared elements, right? What's something that is going to be on every screen or most screens versus not, right? And I think in that sense, like Compose is right now without shared elements. It's really hard to be like, oh, well, this toolbar inside this screen is the same toolbar on this screen, right? Ideally, you don't want those to be like moving side to side when you do animations and things like that. You want it to be a fixed position, which is something that would be really easy with shared elements, but is currently quite tricky, right? So I would say if you have things that need to be shared across multiple screens, then you're probably looking at that like top level scaffold that's outside of the nav host, right, outside of the screen content. But if you're looking at like an individual screen, like, oh, I have a very custom bar just for this screen, right? Then I think there's, it's like, could have it at both levels. Like, no one's gonna stop you. Scaffold is a subcompose layout, so maybe you just actually need a column. Like, you don't need the fanciness of a whole scaffold, right? But I think in the future, as you get shared elements, like, there's certainly going to be more things that you're like, well, right now you can do that, like coordinated, like, oh, when you move screens, also hide this app bar, right? I think that's a pretty common thing, but that might be something that becomes even easier in kind of a shared element world, right? So I'm looking forward to seeing what things change here, but I think right now we're on the like one nav host is good. One nav host is good.
One is enough, and just put a to-do next to it. Like, change when we get shared element transitions.
I mean, it's a long time coming, so I'm looking forward to it a lot. I think there's a lot of interesting patterns that we take for granted in the view world, and a lot of the things that like you're like, oh, like I can create this nice transition between two screens, and like, oh, this small box becomes a big box. Like, oh, wow, that's easy. To be fair, all the shared element APIs also are terrible on the view world. But the ending effect, if you spend the 4 weeks you need on it, looks great.
You know what I keep thinking is that the shared element transitions you get in views were done a long time ago. And I wonder how they break if you use foldables and stuff like that.
Yeah.
If you change posture while the transition is ongoing, what happens? I don't want to know.
Just open the phone mid-transition.
Yeah. That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Just, yes. What are you trying to switch career to, like a QA?
No, you know, I break stuff just by looking at it. I don't need to.
Yeah, Sebastian.
I mean, and to be honest, like that's actually a lot of the hard parts that Doris is working on, right? Where it's like the whole world of Compose is live the whole time while an animation is happening, right? Like, I could swap out one picture that's rectangular for a different picture that's square in the middle of things running. And it's like, well, what should it like start shrinking down because now the dimensions are different? Like, I thought it was going to be rectangular, and now like it's complicated, right? So that whole idea of the whole system is live and needs to react to any change that could be happening, like is certainly challenging when you come to it. But
sounds very easy to reason about.
I mean,
It's very
The
very
navigation-
straightforward.
Yeah, the navigation component doesn't actually display anything on the screen. It's just a holder around the things that display things
That
on the
sounds
screen.
like a not my problem kind of thing.
Well, you should talk to Doris about this, you know, that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah, Sebastiano, thank you for having me, and you should talk to Doris about this.
I mean, I agree. There's a lot of complications there, and even just look ahead layout is already kind of, there's been some libraries already built on top of that, which have been really cool. So I'm excited to see kind of how that works when we start building that into some of the higher levels of Compose. So.
And I want to remind you that Compose is like what, like 2 years? That now they're 2 years, right? No, but you know, the whole stuff that we have been using for like forever. I mean, if I think about when the first time that we looked at fragments, it was like I was young, man. I was young. I mean, I was reading documentation. I joined. I'm doing a course. It's a crash course on a very legacy app, and I saw. I mean, I have goosebumps. I saw an async task in an activity written in Java. Okay?
Do they still exist?
And it was like,
wow.
No. But the thing is legacy. When I say that it's legacy, it's seriously legacy. And you know, and they are not using fragments. And I was like, man. So I was like, okay, fragments. Okay, I was like, they have been here forever, and I was like, no. It was like, but it feels like forever. And then you think about Compose, you know, when you think about the beginning of time and then the human life, you know, like billions of years, and then it's like we are basically arrived yesterday, you know, compared to like Compose. It's still going fast, but there's a lot of stuff to do, and that's the fascinating thing that, you know, like, okay, we don't have it, maybe in 3 months, maybe in 6 months, but again, it's coming. So I love it.
Yeah, there's certainly more we need to do, right? And I think even like this next question about predictive back and stuff like that, like trying to make sure that our guidance aligns with the newest versions of Android and stuff is really important too. So yeah, I think when we've talked about architecture components in the past, it's been library and examples and guidance, right? And it's hard to do all three. It turns out these people in the past who are like, maybe we'll just throw a library over the wall. Simpler days. But now, like, yeah, we need to actually update some of our docs and stuff. Like, talk about how
ain't that the truth?
talk about, you know, hey, you know, like we have this multiple backstack stuff, but you know what that actually is just saving the whole state of your app and then being able to restore it after you've finished a login, right? So maybe it's not, oh, I have these other screens on the backstack. It's, oh, well, let me save all of those screens, you know, in holding, do the login flow. And then once you finish the login, let me restore that state exactly where it was, but now you're logged in, right? So I think there's a lot of, you know, other ways that we want to rewrite the docs and trying to make sure that some of those are. So a big goal for us this year is actually trying to get Navigation Compose out of its one little page of docs and kind of figure out, all right, well, what's all of the pages? Because we have like 21 pages of docs around the navigation component, and like 19 of them also apply to Navigation Compose. But all the examples are in fragments. First few fragments. Your tendrils are long and deep. So now we need to like start ripping all that stuff out and be like, no, we're going to start on Compose, right? We're Compose first at this point. It's 2023, everyone. And we'll have fragments as kind of the other tab for some of these things, right?
Nice one, Mark. Mark said you need to defragment the docs.
Oh man.
I mean, and that's it's complicated, right? Because like as much as we're like compose first, everyone, like, I mean, how many apps do you work on that are all compose, pure compose right now?
No, I'm telling you. I mean, the thing is a long way. It has been, there are tons. I'm happy that we are migrating, apps to compose, and I love the fact that I always advocating for the interoperability, right? What made Kotlin effective was that you had a Java app and you can start using Kotlin. With Compose, you can kind of do the same. Maybe the AGP is yelling at you every now and then, but that's marginal. But again, there's like a lot of fragments, a lot of old code, because if it ain't broken, don't touch it kind of mindset, and that's legit when you're talking about like a business. In a business situation, the thing, it's a hard sell. Okay, let's rewrite everything in Compose.
But why?
Well, not today.
It's like, but it works fine on my Samsung S8 that I, for some reason, still use today. Like, that's why it works fine.
Yeah.
So,
Android
and
6.
that's the thing, right? I think it's always harder when on the inside, because like we're not looking at just one world. Like we're looking at the view world, the compose world, and the migration world, right? And I think we end up having to split our time a little bit more, because there are a lot of apps that aren't on compose yet, and I feel really bad for them. But I also know some of my personal apps are still using recycler view. I'm not happy about it, but that's the world I'm in. Like I don't have the time to rewrite some of them, right? So it's the type of thing where it's like, yeah, I mean, it's going to be a transition world for years now.
Yeah.
So
I actually fixed that problem, Ian. I got a Padawan. I'm delegating the migration and everything. That was like, do you want to pair program? Yeah, sure. Can you? Let's do this together. And then, little by little, they are just picking up the whole thing. And now I have a toddler, I have a dog, I can stream on Twitch, things like that. Like I'm focusing on the other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do find that compose, more than most things, is rather addicting. So once you get your hooks into compose, like it's really, really hard to ever write a recycler view again.
No.
So I get it.
I guess this is the point where I'm saying that the UI framework I work with every day doesn't even have the concept of lazy recycling components. So yay.
Luciano, do you want a hug? Do you want a hug?
I feel like I will go and cry in a corner or something.
Oh,
yeah,
man.
I mean, everyone's at a different point in their life. So, I think it's when we're like, hey, I would love to spend more time on navigation compose. And it's like, well, it's the same team who's also supporting views and stuff also. So, I'm really looking forward to trying to get more stuff out there and like fix some of these issues and, try and look at what CodeGen looks like, right? But it's always going to be a balancing act of priorities, right? As we move towards apps. But the nice part is like even a lot of our internal Google apps are moving more towards Compose now. Like the Play Store is already pretty deep in Compose already. I think they had a blog post about moving a lot of their screens over to Compose. So that momentum is certainly there. And I think, Compose is a big part of that. I think KMP is another interesting, kind of thing that I think that momentum is building there too, right? So I'd love to kind of look at those kind of things too. Obviously, for navigation, we're like 3 layers above most things, but we're already trying to look at hey, like what does paging look like in KMP? Like I think there were some KMP releases just recently from Jetpack, so a lot of the infrastructure pieces are starting to go in there. Like I've certainly been looking at like the view model KMP project that another external person was nice enough to provide to the community here too, and trying to figure out like what that future is for those things, right? And trying to figure out what that triangle looks like in the future, right? Of navigation and DI and state management, right? Because we really want that all those pieces to really work really well together. Yeah.
It will simplify things.
I guess the obvious question is the one that we see at the top now, is like, how do you, if you were on a scale from 1 to 10.
It's a solid 8.5. It's great. I mean, that's the nice part is like we already built the navigation runtime itself kind of as close to platform agnostic, right? Like if you wanted to use it for views, go ahead. If we wanted to use fragments, that was a whole other artifact that will never be campy. But that core piece of like, hey, like we don't have to rely on any of that. So I'd love to do more in that space here. So looking forward to seeing where that's going. So.
Nice. I think we're out of time. We have a bunch more questions. I don't know, what do you want to do with those? Do you want us to tweet them at you so you can answer them?
Do we want to do a rapid fire? Can we do?
Sure. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's get them all done.
All right.
Why the nav host controller has 2 separate functions for navigating to a path and navigation to a deep link? It could be one simple navigate string.
Yeah, we do have navigate string. That's what we use for routes, but deep links could also be actions and MIME types as well as URIs. So it's a whole other set of things that navigation fully supports.
Cool. Foldables and tablets plus navigation. How does navigation handle those item detail screens where on tablets is one screen, but on phone is 2 separate destinations?
Yeah, there was actually a second video from the Android Dev Summit this last year called Navigating on Every Screen Size. So if you're on YouTube, you can look that up. We actually talk specifically about this case and how you should structure your navigation graph to kind of work on all screen sizes.
Awesome. And then maybe we can also ask Roberto when he comes back next time to talk about large screens and foldables.
Yeah, we worked really closely with Alex Vagno about that doc. So we should also have docs to go along with the updated.
And if we don't, we know who to ask. Regarding state down events up, how do you like naming these event args? Some of them make sense as go to detail instead of on primary button click, maybe.
Yeah, I'd always use your business logic reason on why something is clicked, right? So if you clicked on a profile screen, call it go to profile, right? I think this is actually one of those areas where if you think about what does a foldable do versus what's a not foldable do, this might be one of those places where you actually do something different. But always use the business reason of why you're doing this. And I think that'll make the logic for someone like Ivan way clearer when he comes into a brand new project.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that because yeah, there is a click listener and the Lambda is called, you clicked on a button. Yeah, thank you. Fuck. So if you call it to detail, it's a bit better. Thank you.
Does it also come with the Batman?
Yeah, the old one.
I think we kind of covered this already before, but is there any future plan to be able to get some visualization of a navigation graph like we did with XML?
Yeah, we covered that also. I'd love to talk more about the tools team, but turns out that reading Kotlin code, especially when you can have for loops and stuff in it, is a lot more complicated than XML. But love to do more there.
There's one last question from the chat. I'm just gonna take it because we can. Speaking of back gestures and in-app peeking of previous screens, one thing I'm really having a hard time wrapping my head around is how...
We did cover that.
Huh?
We did cover that.
Yeah,
We talked about saving the state of the whole app, showing the login, and then restoring the state afterwards. So there's nothing else on the backside. And
yeah, the peak
we have
stuff.
an open bug to update our docs to kind of take that into account. So watch the recording. It'll be on YouTube, right?
Yes, tomorrow.
Any day now, right?
Damn, that was very much a rapid fire question answering. Yeah, when those docs come, that'd be awesome to read. I agree, Stylianos. But as Ian said, there's a lot of docs to write for composer navigation, and I am also looking forward to it because I've also used it only once or twice, and I'm quite sure that what I've done in our sample app in Bundle is also probably mostly wrong in some cases. So I'll be there and I'll try to figure it out. And if I cannot figure it out, Ian, do you mind coming back?
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back and actually sit down with an app that you want to maybe do the modularization part and see how that actually works out. So
cool.
Thanks so much.
Love it.
Thank you. This was very, very insightful and super cool. Ivan, do you have any closing thoughts, any closing words besides saying thank you for making your future life easier?
Thank you for the amount of information that you shared. I love it, and I love the fact that the thing is moving at a fast pace, and it's a lot of new stuff is coming. So I'm happy. I'm happy when you're fixing things and adding stuff. So I'm very, very happy.
Still more to do, but we'll get there.
So gracias, Mark, para el Ivano. Ian, I'm learning Spanish, so every now and then Mark Ellison forces me to speak Spanish live. So if you quieres ayudarse.
Look at that!
I love it. I love it. Gracias por el soporto, el ayuda. Thank you to everybody. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. It's important for us. And if you want to support us in any fashion, you can subscribe for free. If you have Amazon Prime, you can buy merch. You can buy the pin. You can buy the T-shirt. You can become a subscriber, like a monthly subscriber, like Aurelio and Mark and Sasha and the others. And it will fund things like the stickers that we send around for free. Carmen, I need to ship the stickers to Carmen. Sorry, Carmen. Yeah, come on, I have a busy life. Sorry, but yeah, thank you for the support in any fashion. And if you want to join our post episode private chat on Meet with the guest and the others, pick the right tier on Coffee. I think it's the bruschetta one, and you can access the Discord server, and then you can access the Google Meet invite. And yeah, thank you again for coming. Sebastiano, thank you for hosting.
Okay, see you all on the Meet in a few minutes. Well, in a couple of minutes, I guess. And yeah, by the way, we are off for 3 weeks because I'm taking some very much needed vacation. Sorry.
Boo.
But we will be back on the 3rd of May. And I am sure that when we do, you're going to be very happy about what we're going to do, because it's not going to be Android. We're going to be doing Swing.
So what was it? It's the plugin,
yes.
The plugin episode.
We're gonna see how to create a plugin for IntelliJ and AndroidStudio with a developer advocate from JetBrains.
Best of luck. I'm sure that'll be super easy.
I mean, we're gonna tackle something very, 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 very simple because we have an hour and a half. Okay, everyone, see you next month. Have a great time, and bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.